digitaljamsessions.com.
Welcome to this panel, which is Museums in the 21st Century, Thinking in 4D, because we like to be a little bit more visual in the museums industry. We are joined today on this lovely stage by the lovely Patrick from Curious Space. We have Kate from the V&A, and we have Rupert from Animal, Vegetable, Mineral. I'll get it in the right order.
I mean, that's the branding. You don't forget that.
What I would like to do is ask you to very briefly explain a little bit more about who you are and what you do, and then we will dive straight into the conversation.
So, hello everyone, I'm Patrick Vernier. I'm from a little company called Curious Space, and we design mainly for museum exhibitions and stage, and we've done some events, and we've done a wildlife park, just to give you a bit of a wide range. Okay.
I'm Kate Bailey. I'm a senior curator and producer at the V&A. I work in the Department of Theatre and Performance. I've just recently curated a big exhibition called Opera, Passion, Power and Politics. So we create performance exhibitions, and we are very embracing of technology. And I worked with Patrick on the recent opera exhibition, and we're always looking to push what we can do in the museum environment to bring more performance and technology inside what we do.
Hi, I'm Rupert Harris. I'm the creative director of Animal, Vegetable, Mineral, and we are a creative technology company specializing in creating immersive content and applications for that content. So that is, we work with organizations like museums, galleries, and increasingly sports clubs, football clubs. Anywhere there's an experience, we are taking that experience and extending that out and creating content around and with that.
You have a lovely echo going on as well.
Feedback.
So we may notice there is an empty chair on the end here, so I'll give you some forewarning that the lovely Anise is going to join us at some point, hopefully fingers crossed. So when somebody suddenly leaps into this chair, don't be surprised. It is planned, and we will introduce Anise when she gets here. But in the meantime, before we commence the conversation, I'd love to know a little bit more about who I'm talking to. So I would love to find out from you lovely people, who here has actually... or does actually work in the museums or exhibition space, by show of hands? Anybody? One of you, two of you? Ooh, awesome, okay. And who here is working in the 360 or VR industries? Who here would just be generally broadcast and entertainment? Okay, and anybody else who's here just for the heck of it? Because you wanted a seat and it was the end of the day? Okay, I like your honesty, young man. Awesome. Right, so having said that, thank you for your contributions and welcome. So one of the things that we're looking at is where things are going in terms of museums and exhibitions and thinking in 4D. Now, one of the first and most obvious questions is, how do we bring these things to life? Because the whole element of what we're doing with immersive technologies or any kind of application of technology into the exhibit is trying to bring it to life beyond that physical exhibition of the thing that people go in to actually see in that moment. And I'm curious from your experiences, I'm going to start with you, Kate, in terms of what you're using the technology for in terms of bringing that to life beyond the physical exhibit, and how we're actually bringing it to life beyond that moment.
Well, at the V&A, we've been creating performance exhibitions for some years, and we have gone out to theatre in terms of our ways of storytelling and ways of interpreting our exhibition subjects. So that's the first point, using the kind of tools of theatre and embracing, I guess, through that, the use of sound, the use of light, the use of video in an exhibition context to try and create a visceral or a live experience within the exhibition. So we tend to work on, with the Bowie exhibition, we worked with 59 Productions, who are a company that work a lot with video mapping and storytelling and design within theatre, and bringing that practice into what we did with the David Bowie Is exhibition. With opera, obviously working with Patrick and Curious Space. But I think for us, it's about creating an experience that lives up now to the visitor experience of an immersive exhibition, and thinking about our narratives, our subjects, with a 4D approach.
Okay, so I'm going to throw this one at you, Rupert, because I know that we started to have this conversation, and I think it's a natural transition from where Kate is going here. And you kind of said something earlier on where you talked about the relevance of the physical location of a museum.
Yeah.
And where we're kind of moving to next, and why it's relevant to be doing things in 4D or be trying to bring it to life beyond the physical building as such. So why don't you share some of your slightly controversial views?
Well, I think it's a relevant question, which is, in a world where the museum, the physical location, is the only place you can experience that, it makes great sense to have monolithic buildings where you can go in there and they house thousands and thousands of people, and they're there to share that experience with the broadest number of people possible. In the world that we live in now, that's no longer the case, and so I think it's important to keep asking that question: what's the value that the physical building gives you? What does the physical experience give you, and what should a museum experience look like in the 21st, 22nd century? And what are the KPIs, if you like, for an organisation in terms of their reach? What are their objectives in creating that exhibition? Because one would always expect that would be making sure it can get out to the largest possible audience possible. And being able to do that, one no longer needs a big building to do it. You can distribute things digitally. So I think, there are pros and cons. You can gain and lose some things. And I don't think the digital delivers for everything. But it's certainly, I think it's always a question that needs to be kind of borne in mind when you're creating something. Is the physical the best place for it to be? And, who's that audience and how are we best able to reach them?
Okay, so when we're talking about this idea of maybe the physical space not being the most relevant place to actually show the content, so to speak, one of the kind of natural questions then would be is how do you personalize that experience, that content, to be something that somebody can carry with them if they're not going to carry it with them in the physical building as such, but to at least be able to interact with that content in a more meaningful manner, just generalistically. And I know, Patrick, this is one of the things that you guys have kind of been focusing on, is that idea of the personal experience that somebody can carry with them, or beyond that moment. How do they extend their experience beyond what they initially saw?
Our work is really, first of all, make that experience very valid. So somehow it's how to, start with this, how the museum environment gives you a chance to give a very unique type of experience that you couldn't get anywhere else. Now, I think this gives ground to then start to develop or try to find a way to transfer that very specific experience into a digital world. I think that would be possible. But just to help people understand, for us, it's just like, and to complement what Kate is saying, the way we approach exhibition is a promenade theater show. So you're taken into a very special world, your usual world behind, and then you've got objects or content, which could be digital or could be sound, that takes you on an emotional journey and interact with you like actors would do. So that's the sort of experiential level that you can bring in a museum. And in a world like today, it's a very unique thing because you're away from screens, you're stimulated in a very specific timeline at your own rhythm, so it's still a very personalized experience, and you can get this experience. Now, the similarity with the world Rupert is talking about is, for example, in the Vienna exhibition, you have a very individualized experience. Each visitor has a sound headphone, and sound will be triggered in relationship to its position. The sound will be fade in and fade out, which tailors very specifically what feels like a very individualized and private experience. So that gives us the feeling that there is possibly a way to take this and move it into a digital world. And then it's how to translate the richness of this multi-sensorial experience into a different context. And then there's a lot of questions around it.
Yeah, and we almost did that in the setting up of the exhibition.
Yeah.
We're thinking of it in a virtual space before it becomes a real thing. So at the point of the virtual creation or the use of your set models, if that had become a virtual exhibition at that point, it wouldn't have been so sad when we closed the exhibition last week.
There was a hope that we could use some game developing platform like Entity, and we could basically use the set was already designed and tailor the sound and visual experience with a very precise way so that the visitors could be even more precisely
Welcome.
Sort of, well, yes.
Not that we're trying to call attention to the fact that Anise has just arrived.
Very, very subtle. I don't think they do.
Yeah, which means we could have been basically in a virtual version of the exhibition before it,
Yes.
and then use this to move forward with other ideas, which didn't happen this time.
Okay, so I have a lovely question that I'm going to hurl at you. But first, you're going to introduce yourself to this lovely lot and explain exactly who you are, Anise, and exactly what you do with culture.
So first of all, apologies for the delay. So that's technology not helping me. We got lost with the car. Anyway, so I'm Anaïs Saguer. I'm the project director for an initiative that was spearheaded by the V&A called REACH, Reproduction of Art and Cultural Heritage. And it's really about looking at how the museum and heritage sector should engage and embrace with confidence the fourth industrial revolution to some degree, and really look at digital reproduction as a way to better or enhance the way we deliver our mission in terms of studying, preserving, and sharing our collections. So that will be from this angle that I will speak, and I'm the founder of a new consultancy practice called Culture Connect, which is really about looking at how our sector could play a role in building or rebuilding bridges between people and countries.
Thank you. So I want to follow on from what Patrick was saying, because there is a couple of interesting points that were raised there, and that is the idea of, first of all, Kate's already mentioned kind of using elements of theatre and immersive theatre and some of the technology and the methodologies that are used within that. And then Patrick kind of mentioned about, game technology and kind of using game and gamifying to kind of create those virtual worlds, and you could have inserted it into a virtual world. So what I want to understand is, what are these other verticals, these other industries where you feel that there are lessons to be learned and applied to the museum and exhibit spaces? And what is it that you think you can learn from them? Because I think that there are some really interesting other industries that are doing very interesting things with immersive technology and 4D and various other things, but they aren't necessarily yet being applied. So I'm curious to find out what your thoughts are on that. And Liz, why don't we start with you?
So I think it's really interesting, and we touch a bit on that when we prepared the panel. I think while the initiative of REACH is really sort of trying to be forward-looking, probably I have to say the museum and heritage sector is probably slightly behind in embracing sort of the digital world and all the possibilities that it is offering to the sector. And to me, the performing art world has been much more advanced in embracing this new technology. And one example I remember in 2011 being sitting at Sadler's Wells and watching the fantastic show Daesh from Akram Khan, where he's kind of dancing with an animation. And it's really looking at how this kind of hybrid or sort of sharing and mixing of different fields could really help us to tell stories in different ways. And I think one of the big shifts today with sort of the global world we live in is the fact that we are recognizing that with heritage, there is no longer one narrative. It's a multiple of narratives. And with the ability of looking and sharing things in a virtual way and enabling people to engage and to tell their story as well, we are enabling this multiplicity of voices. And that's something our sector is starting to engage. And I think the V&A is quite sort of advanced at the forefront of that.
Okay. So one of the kind of other areas that we want to discuss was this idea of how we, I hesitate to use the word modernize, but one of the things that is kind of important for us to do is to understand, how do we get younger people, the next generation, the digital native generation, to have a passion and an interest in museum and exhibition and what we do and the stories that we're telling and the narratives that we're trying to articulate. And just as a mini exercise amongst you lovely people over here, because I like to have conversations with the audience, just by show of hands, how many of you happen to have a smartphone with you out of interest? Great, awesome. As a hypothetical mental exercise, if I said to you, unlock your phone and hand it to somebody you do not know and let them have a rummage in your phone, how many of you, by show of hands, might feel slightly anxious, stressed out, slightly nervous about the idea of a complete stranger having access to everything in your mobile phone? Honesty? Anybody feel slightly nervous? Or if I said to you, actually, we're going to take the smartphone away from you and you can't use it for at least 6 months. Anybody feel slightly nervous about the idea of not having access to any kind of smartphone for a little while? Great, perfect. You are a living example of the digital native generation's relationship to technology, which is that you have formed an emotional attachment to a piece of technology, a block of technology, a device that has no emotion whatsoever, yet you have applied an emotion to it. You feel stress or anxiousness if somebody is looking at it or using it in a way that you haven't defined. And so when we talk about the relationship with technology, what I want to understand is how do we make the younger generation who have this inherent relationship and emotional attachment to technology feel that emotion around the experiences that you guys are trying to create in 4D or digital experiences when it comes to museums, culture, exhibition. How do we make them feel as passionately about that as they do about this native device that's in their pocket? And I throw that open to the floor, but I get the sense that Rupert has something to say.
So, I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, we are experimenting with creating tools to enable people to kind of capture objects in 3D, so based on a mobile phone app. And one of the elements of this project is talking to museums and galleries and organizations about giving those tools to kids in schools, so that then when they go to a museum, they can kind of capture content within that museum and then take that back to the classroom and almost curating their own exhibitions within that. And I think, that starts to become interesting the minute you're kind of passing things over. And of course, there are lots of intellectual property issues to be dealt with here. But giving people ownership and enabling to personalize stuff is critical, I think.
Everyone can be a curator.
Yeah. And finding tools that they can share that. And we discussed this momentarily earlier. Facebook have just released an application which enables you to share 3D content sort of within the Facebook API. So you can now scan an object and upload that onto Facebook, and there's a little 3D object that will rotate in there, and then you can download that and print that somewhere else. So we're beginning to see the idea of kind of 3D sharing becoming a mainstream proposition. You heard it here first. But and that's the kind of thing we're going to hook into. And of course, with notions of how people might use virtual reality and virtual reality headsets, Facebook have obviously got a vested interest in pushing virtual reality. But using Facebook as that platform is an interesting way of starting that.
And one of the things that we've found, particularly with the opera exhibition, is obviously the exhibition format and deconstruct something can kind of help us create moments and live moments. And as well as the exhibition, we've run a program where the museum is a stage, and we found that particularly exciting for a younger audience, so that actually it's not just always about them coming at it with their phones. It's more about becoming part of something and the connectivity of the physical museum space and creating these moments where they can come together with shared narratives.
Wonderful. Very briefly, I'm going to pause in the flow of conversation, but I'm going to come back to you in a second, Kate. I am apparently supposed to remind you all, if you have questions, to go to glisser.it/BVE18, which is on the back there, the right-hand side URL. Thank you, Patrick. And basically pose your questions so that I am aware. Apparently there's a tablet lurking around that I will be given that will tell me what your questions are. But feel free to ask your questions via Glisser. But going back to this conversation, Kate, one of the things that we discussed earlier as well was also kind of this balance between VR and AR. Now, a lot of people, they all want to talk about VR because it's the in thing, it's the hot topic right now. But realistically, when it comes to museums and exhibition spaces, AR is probably more valuable, more realistic in terms of actually being able to enhance the experience for the attendee or the visitor, and actually be able to bring something extra to the table. So I'd love to hear more about your thoughts in regards to the benefits of AR versus VR.
Yeah, I mean, I think the platform of VR is very exciting on many levels, but for a museum, if you want to augment what you have, obviously AR is very exciting. In an exhibition context, the kind of concept of VR is quite problematic. We worked with headphone experience on Opera, which is actually quite an easy system to kind of deliver, but the idea of bringing people through and putting headsets on and pulsing them, it doesn't really add up in an exhibition context. So the idea of being able to take the museum world and augment it with an additional layer is very exciting. And even this idea of mixing realities so that perhaps you have an object and perhaps you can then see beyond that object to other layers of interpretation. So I think we have the perfect starting point for developing some of these things, but the way to make it relevant to the museum is to bring it back to the collections or the galleries.
Which brings me to another interesting question, which I know that we've spoken about before, which is actually finding the right partners to do this. In as much as museums or destination venues, it's not necessarily your area of expertise to know who's doing what cool stuff with what cool technology, versus people like Patrick and Rupert who are doing very interesting things, but don't necessarily know which museums are interested in that technology at this moment in time. So I'm curious in terms of your experiences in connecting those dots and having those conversations, or how you surface those conversations to happen. Anissa, I'm curious from your perspective how you've kind of come across some of those conversations.
I think it's a point about sort of the demands on museum are increasing. I will respond to the point, but I just wanted to sort of touch on this VR element. And sort of, for me, what's really exciting is actually the ability of this digital reproduction to really fully unlock the inspirational potential that the collections we have could have. It's really like if you put on Facebook or whatever platform, if you release files about object from your collection that could be remixed by other people, suddenly it's like really fully unlocking this creative potential that our collection have. And that's bringing to sort of the younger generation, because they could own this collection, but not as you own a physical object, but owning the idea, the sort of all the history behind that. And it's sort of a continuity of the creative human mind passing on in a much more impactful full way. And I think what the digital does, it's really creating or enabling our museum object to become like creative Lego blocks. And I think especially in the case of the V&A, it's really suddenly unlocking this full potential that this collection have. Now, in terms of collaboration, I think in the field of digital, as in other fields, museums have increasing demands on what they are supposed to be doing, the scope of their work. So that's something that in the coming years is going to be increasingly important, knowing to bring in other expertise. And again, I will turn to the performing art world, where they are used to work with all these different experts, which is something in the case of very immersive exhibition like opera or David Bowie or other exhibition like that, you have a little bit of this kind of performing art kind of collaborative work, but that's something we need to improve. And one way to manage that is for us to be clear about what is the purpose, because we need to make sure it is enhancing our mission, and we're not just doing that for the sake of engaging with technology.
Yeah.
Okay, Rupert,
I think that's interesting. You know, when you begin to bring theatre into the experience, you know, and in the museum there's a conflict there of sorts, which is that, you know, typically one expects, you know, a degree of I hesitate to use the word truth, but I'll run with that. You know, the information is being passed over, and you're gaining some knowledge, and that is founded on the reputation of the V&A, and this is all fact-checked and all the rest of it. Whereas the theatrical narrative experience tends to be more interpretative, and so you come away with something with a notion of, you know, there is no specific interpretation. There's, you know, you can run with your authorial biographical fallacy or whatever, however you want to look at it. It doesn't really matter, because actually the experience is the thing. Whereas it would be interesting to see museums embrace that sort of interpretative approach and then bring that back to technology. The idea where if the device that you took with you when you went to a museum was able to somehow inform the museum something about you, information you wanted to share, so that the experience you have might be personalized to you. So it wasn't, you know, a one-to-many experience where the information was being handed over, but in fact something entirely different where everybody could have an almost entirely different experience. That would be fascinating. Did I answer any question?
It's interesting that you bring this up though, because there are people out there in the tech side of the world who are doing this already.
Yeah.
And they have that data and they know how to utilize that data for analytical purposes or econometric purposes or planning of footfalls. I mean, theme park industry is a great example of this. But we're not necessarily seeing this kind of connecting yet with the museums industry as such. But, Kate, you have a view on this?
I was just going to say that we were having these kind of conversations around creating new sound experiences within the museum environment and how you could personalize those by taking through some form of AI, through gathering not just where you are, but who you are and what your makeup is, and therefore what your flow should then be within the V&A's collections. So then it becomes something really exciting. So I guess like those apps which play the music that respond to your well-being, your state of mind, that if you could take that one step further into a museum environment, it could be a very exciting experience.
So would you get a soundtrack of the 80s if you were a certain age or not?
Yeah.
Patrick?
Well, it's quite interesting that you mentioned this because we're currently bidding for a new exhibition work, and we were exactly debating this in the last 2 days. It was to try to create an experience where everybody could feel it's theirs so that it's individualized. And so obviously we fantasized on bringing actual individualized context within this and be able to accumulate these individual, in this specific context of this exhibition, I can't mention right now, a sort of a survey as well. It was kind of accumulating data locally of people who have gathered there and decided to participate democratically somehow in this process. So I think it's always, when it gets healthy, it goes both ways. We're seeking new technology to feed our stories, and then it goes both ways. Suddenly we get inspired, and I think that's what's happening now somehow.
Yeah, that's interesting.
Oh no, it's just about one of the things that Patrick did with the opera exhibition as well was not just think about the individual experiences, to assess the collective power. And I think that's something which in some ways perhaps comes from a slight theme park culture. No offense, Patrick. No. But and I'm excited by that, and I've definitely borrowed from certain. So that the idea of creating moments or show moments within a museum experience is something we're now not scared of. That then bring together the individual experience into a shared collective.
So if there's anybody in the audience who does any kind of analytics or data capture, collection, big data, anything like that, these lovely people would love to talk to you. Just saying. But you mentioned there about something that you're bidding for right now.
Yeah.
And one of the questions that I'm sure is burning in the mind of some of the people sitting over here is funding and how one goes about funding a technical-based exhibit or museum, piece, be that content or experience, how you would go about finding that funding. Now, I know that Rupert has lots of views on this one, so I'm going to start with you.
Well, I mean, we're always looking for money, so if anyone's got any. I mean, there are organisations, there are government organisations which give out, grants to the stuff. Organisations like the Space, which is space.org. I don't know if you've worked with these guys, but they're kind of, helping promote, great art digitally. I think is a tagline for that. There are, sponsors, of course. I mean, Kate will know an awful lot more about this than I do. We work with, private individuals and cases. We're doing a project at the moment with an artist where there's a French philanthropist who's interested in virtual reality content, and he's an art collector, and so he's funding something directly. But you need to be creative. You're always hustling, to find different ways. And it's not like the broadcast world where there's a commissioner, and in fact even that's changed now. But the days of getting full funding from BBC One or whatever are over. But you're always out there scratching around for cash and trying to pull stuff together. So,
Kate, I know that you've had a couple of different approaches to funding in terms of sponsorships and the way that that's kind of been built up to create the funding that you needed for some of the shows that you have. Would you care to kind of drill down into that a little bit for us?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking specifically about exhibitions as opposed to some of the projects like Space, the research projects. I think we obviously have a development department that looks to seek sponsors, the right sponsors for the right exhibition. But I think beyond that, the technical partner is crucial. Obviously, we've worked with Sennheiser on the Bowie exhibition and the Pink Floyd exhibition, and that partnership with a sound partner is really liberating for a museum who usually has no money to afford to develop certain things. So I think finding the right tech partner for the right content is a way of perhaps pushing what the museum sector can do with minimal resources.
Oh, Patrick?
Well, yes, we're kind of the end users of what these people manage to do, and we do our best with what's available. I guess as a designer, what very often happens is that we come up with an idea during that specific process, because you're exposed to a specific brief, a specific context, and you're working with very up-to-date people, so new even ideas of using technology in a new way could happen, and that's usually in a very short available time, because here it's ambitious exhibition, we're working on 18 months on it, so let's say we're possibly slightly over a year before we're going to use that technology, but still, if you need some research and development, you're talking a really short amount of time. So it's always challenging. So it's still, I think there's still a work to be done to sort of preempt relevant partners or facilitate the speed at which partners could be associated with the project so that these things could develop further. Because I think it would really multiply big time what we could achieve in this context. I think there's a lot to happen still in museum context, at least, to speak of one. Yeah.
So one of the kind of things that you just mentioned there about research and development funding and the kind of approach of R&D. And just as a kind of a knowledge point for anybody who is thinking about trying to fund something and doing it from an R&D perspective, I'm going to ask the question by show of hands. Anybody here a member of Immersive UK? Woo! Good for you. You're ahead of the crowd. If you're not already a member of Immersive UK, please go visit immerseuk.org. It's immerseuk.org, I'm pretty sure. But basically, it's a free membership. It doesn't cost you anything. It's run by the Knowledge Transfer Network, Innovate UK, and the Digital Catapult. It's specifically there to, A, help you connect with people like this who are looking for technology companies who are, wanting to work with other industries, but also, B, to help you to find and identify the funding calls for R&D. So they actually have the money to give you, first of all, but second of all, they can also tell you when the money is coming out from different funding sources. So please go check out Immerse UK. They're there to help you. That's exactly why they're there. So if you're looking for R&D funding, good place to go. But, Anise, your thoughts?
So I think it's linked to this question of collaboration. I mean, the example, when you I think the best way, of course, you have to sort of put your creative hat, and it's complex, and we're all competing for the same source of money. But I think sort of the case we could do with museum is the opportunity to also use this public platform as a pilot to trial and testing. So again, that's the point Patrick was making about bringing people early on board. And I think there could be really interesting innovation if those tech partners could see the opportunity that an exhibition or engaging with something where you're pretty sure. I mean, if you go at the V&A, you have 3+ million visitors every year. So you're going to have a mass where you could trial things. So I think that's the case. We need to work a bit more collaboratively on the development of technology. And what we bring is collections and people that could interact with those things. So I think that's the way.
I think that's a very interesting point, in as much as the museums bring something very valuable to these people who are trying to develop, whether it's an immersive theatre or a VR or a 360 experience. The fact that you've got the content, you've got the audiences, and this is a great testing ground to be able to experiment in a reasonably safe environment to kind of, figure out what's going to work and what's not going to work, and have that scope, that space to be able to do that. But what I am going to do, because I'm really aware of time, is jump to the questions that some of you are actually using, Lisa. So, first question, personalized museums might lead to the loss of what a museum is about. A museum is meant to be a place to explore and learn, breaking your own viewpoints and stereotypes. Is creating filter bubbles in places of learning a good idea? Kate?
Filter bubbles, you say?
Yes. I'm all for breaking down filter bubbles, and I think that the more we create awareness with the potential for what the museum can offer, the more the shared experience will become valuable, because at the end of the day, we want people to come. And of course, we are thinking about our global audiences, But no, I would never want to undermine the physical experience of visiting a museum and seeing an object.
Okay. We have another question here that says, security guards prevent vandalism in museums. Is it as easy to protect and maintain VR and AR environments? Maybe user participation and manipulation would be encouraged on these platforms, but how would they be regulated and maintained? Rupert?
Interesting question. I mean, I think we'd be delighted to have a VR museum in which enough people in there who wanted to interact with it that they might vandalise. That might make it more intriguing. I don't think that's a problem we're going to see anytime soon. But certainly, I mean, there's a serious point there about how you kind of secure kind of digital spaces and public spaces and make them kind of safe environments for everyone to go. I don't know what the answer is beyond the obvious.
Well, I'm going to throw in on this one. I'm just sorry. This is my area of expertise, VR. But what I will say is that AltSpace VR was a shared collaborative community experience, kind of like a virtual world MMO experience, massively multiplayer online experience, where lots of people could go and they could all rummage around and explore things. And yes, that did lead to the opportunity for people to abuse each other or to invade each other's space or to do things that you just generally don't want people to do in a shared collaborative space. And so what they created was the personal bubble, which basically meant that if somebody got too close to you or was being too abusive or were doing something that was disruptive to the environment, essentially there was a little bubble that would be a protective sphere around them, which meant that they basically disappeared. And nobody else could see them anymore. And the more that they tried to interact with you, the more they disappeared. So if they came closer to you, they vanished. And as they moved back, they came back into view. And so it discouraged that kind of behavior because it basically made them invisible. They couldn't see themselves, they couldn't hear themselves, and they couldn't hear others. So what's the point in being abusive? So that's one of the ways in which that kind of thing is being approached in VR already, and there are already solutions available for that kind of thing.
So VR Chat's another one which is getting some traction at the moment, which is an environment where you can adopt an avatar and you go in there. And we were tinkering around with this on Friday. I was chatting to some people from Nicaragua, actually. And you can if they're being annoying, you can turn off their audio, so they're still prancing around in front of you. But I think the benefits, I think at this point in time, we're still feeling quite positive about that. We haven't yet reached that tipping point where the scale of it and the amount of trolling has become kind of problematic.
We did host an exploratory project around VR and opera and conflict resolution last week, which was a fantastic beginning of a discussion amongst how bubbles could be broken through opera as an art form in a virtual environment, which was quite out of my headspace anyway.
I think this is one of those topics we could go on for a really long time because it also kind of raises that question around digital identity and virtual identity in virtual spaces. But what I will say is for the person who asked that question, go look at the games industry. They have lots of solutions to these types of issues. Okay, so the next question is there an issue with using the words content as opposed to exhibit or items? Is the implementation of technology solely to augment the existing museum experience, or can it be used to create a totally new experience, one that might be more relevant with the technology native generation? Patrick.
Complex question. Yes, complex question. A long one. Let me just go back. So basically we're trying to tackle whether digital content,
whether or not the word content is something that should be applied in this context, or if we're trying to create something entirely new when we use technology. I'm assuming that's the right interpretation of the question, whoever asked the question.
I'm going back to the title of this stage. It's about telling a story. So I think everything is content, a relationship to a story. And it can be an artifact, could be a digital thing. And this new thing will tell a new story. So then I think it's difficult to go further than that, really. We never approach things with boxes. It's always in relationship with the experience and the story. I think that's what's crucial in this situation.
Okay.
I think that point, talking about telling a story, because I think that's a kind of, that's a kind of dialect that we're very used to. But in a virtual environment, it's interesting to think of it as exploring a space, rather than telling a story that, to break away from that idea of linearity and that you can explore in any direction you want and create your own journey through that. And I guess that comes back to that point about personalization. It's not necessarily that everything's up for interpretation. You can come out with whatever you want, but that you might hear a different voice. And if you went in there and you're a 5-year-old child, probably the voice that you want telling you about Cézanne or Renoir might be a different one than if you're a 40-year-old man.
I would just respond to that because I think you make a very good point here. It doesn't mean that the museum exhibition is necessarily linear neither, because I'm englobing in the story some brief which were systemic for us in we work. So you're actually exploring a space as the story that you built yourself. So even this is actually happening. And I guess it's, again, for us, it was feeding back from new forms of novel writing, but it came back as well from different forms of exploring games and digital world. So this new approach to the actual narrative structure of exhibition is, again, cross-fed from thing. And that's what's happening in theatre,
Yes.
and that's why it's feeding back now into this world. Just to
With
wrap
the
it up
risk of
quickly.
falling into another vortex. This is definitely a vortex risk zone. But what I will say is this: if anybody is particularly interested in immersive and kind of VR, AR storytelling formats and structures, it's worth having a little look for something. Just Google it. It's spherical narrative, and the name Rob Yescombe, Yescombe. That's a really interesting look at non-linear storytelling and different ways of articulating storytelling in immersive environments. But going to the last question, I'm so determined to get to this last question before we get cut off. Where we see partnerships with art spaces and broadcasters already, is there a place for content utilizing new exciting tech like 360 and OBM as ways to reach and engage younger, non-traditional demographics? It's a wider question. Or is it price point, adaptivity, footage, quality going to always be an issue? Brackets, once it becomes mainstream, it loses appeal. Close brackets. Who wants to take that question?
Once again.
It's a really long question. Basically, I'm going to summarize. I apologize to whoever asked this question. I'm going to summarize. And basically, I think what they're asking is whether or not, with partnerships, whether there is a place for getting the younger demographic to get involved, but is it reliant on price points and adaptivity and quality, or is this just kind of a passing fad, basically?
Well, VR. I think it's around. I think it's going to stick around, but I think we're going to see it in very specific areas. It's working, and I think the kind of mass adoption model that we are used to with television and radio isn't going to happen for a while, if ever.
Anybody else want to take that one on?
Well, I guess what that question made me think about, and also the last question, was that obviously the V&A has been around 150 years more than, and has always embraced what's coming next. And whether that was the moment where it started to collect photography, or the moment where it started to collect theatre, or the fact that we have this incredible sort of cast courts, which was a very early idea of making reproductions. And so that the sense that we need to make sure that we're not just engaging this technology, but preserving it and thinking about how this moment might be in 150 years' time for the museum sector.
I'm going to throw one to the back of what you just said, and I'm just going to point out this, which is that for a lot of people who are getting into VR and AR entertainment storytelling formats, if we look at the film industry and the fact that it took maybe a decade to get to where we are now, from a steam engine coming at you in black and white and people running from the theatre screaming because they thought they were about to get run over, and in the games industry going from something like Pong to The Last of Us, which took about 40 years, give or take, with VR and AR and where we're at with immersive entertainment, we're still in a very early stage of storytelling and what that storytelling looks like. And if, as you say, this is about preserving culture and having those early examples, for posterity, then now is exactly the right time to be capturing these early attempts at storytelling in these immersive entertainment formats. So, yeah.
And I think we have an exhibition coming up on video gaming, so that will be quite an interesting kind of exhibition for the V&A to present.
Awesome.
When's that on? Give it a good plug.
Okay. This autumn. Yeah.
Anis, do you have something to add?
I think this question of preserving the digital is a big issue, and it came up a lot in the sort of global consultation we had for Reach. It's the question of what do you keep, what sort of system, because you need to sort of be able to see that or play that in the future. And that is a very complex question. We're talking about money. I think there is one of the big challenges we're going to have as museum and cultural heritage sector is how are we going to store all that, and how are we going to be able to share and display this? And I think that's a big question which is way beyond sort of any cultural players. And I think one of the point of reach is we're bringing this conversation back to UNESCO this spring to engage governments level, because I think there is a question of what sort of investment in storage infrastructure governments would want to invest in order to make sure we could preserve that. One thing that was really interesting in terms of looking at how do we capture what's happening in the digital sphere today was one of the projects when I was still working as a head of international at the V&A. We've opened recently a new gallery in Shenzhen. And as part of the display, we acquire WeChat, which is, for those who don't know, it's kind of the WhatsApp equivalent in China, but much more. Basically, you could do everything with WeChat. And we went to Tencent, which is the company that built that, which is based in Shenzhen. And it was very complex, but also the question of if we have that in our collection, we're supposed to be able to make sure that in 150 years' time, people will be able to see that. And that's a very complex process where, again, collaboration with digital people is fundamental because we don't have these skills and knowledge in the museum.
Well, I'm really aware that we're over time before somebody literally drags us off this stage. What I would like to do is thank you all for your attention and your patience. I know you have a question. Come and ask us physically when we're done, because apparently we don't have a microphone to come to you. But what I want to do is thank the lovely Patrick, Kate, Rupert and Anise for their time today. And thank you all for being here.
Thinking of starting your own podcast? Why not speak to the GL Pro UK team? They handle all of our podcasting service needs. Tell them that Digital Jam Session sent you and you'll get 10% off your first order. Find out more at www.glpro.co.uk.
digitaljamsessions.com